beginning, I'll tell you, I had the opportunity to go see Jerry Bruce and his Bayview District Foundation in New Orleans. Erica in my office, Alex, and I went over there, and I'll tell you, the conversation about what got us here today was actually started after we had gone over there, and of course, completely oversimplifying how we would do this, I just said, man, I'd love to get all the stakeholders in this community, this room that we've invited here today, on a bus over there to just see it, just to be able to. But as we thought that through a little more, and saying, hey, the mayor's asking me to get on some bus and go somewhere that I don't know where I'm going, we thought it would be better to do what I just described a minute ago, which is let's set the foundation of the work that has been done here, that has been invested in, and then Jerry was gracious enough to make the drive himself over here to tell us about his project. And so that's not off the table, for the applause out there. The phase two certainly could be that we go over there and check it out. I'm not eliminating that option, but we thought we would bring this presentation and the great work that Jerry and his team have done over in New Orleans that we got to see, to share that with you, let you ask some questions, and we'll work out bus details a little bit later. But anyway, let me introduce Jerry. As a founding member of the Bayview District Foundation, Jerry Bruce serves as the organization's chairman of the board. A native of New Orleans, Mr. Bruce is president of Monarch Real Estate Advisors and is a well-known innovator in both civic and business arenas with 25 years of commercial real estate and property development experience. Mr. Bruce also serves on the board of several local philanthropic and business development groups and is an alumnus of Washington and Lee and Tulane University. So welcome, Jerry Bruce.
Thank you all, and thanks for the opportunity to visit with you. I will share in the invitation. I think we've hosted 120 delegations from cities across the country and 15 countries that have visited the site to see what can be done and see if it's an example of the type of work that could be undertaken in venues like the Baptist site here. You want to go on? I'm going to really kind of go back a little bit and talk about how we got to starting the work and some of the things that we did along the way. After Katrina, the foundation really was created after Katrina as we thought about how we rebuild our city and rebuild our homes and businesses. And we were invited, a group of us were invited to Atlanta to see the East Lake development there, which was really one of the first major holistic redevelopments. It included took former public housing and raised that public housing, and then brought in workforce housing, mixed income housing, together with schools as a center of the community, health facilities, recreational facilities, and built that, wrapped that all into one wrapper. We spent a day and a half there just kind of trying to understand, and we drank from the Kool-Aid, and as we got back on the plane, we said, if we could do something like this in New Orleans, it could really be a game changer. And none of us had ever been in this world, been in the space where you're dealing in public-private partnerships. So we got back to New Orleans and said, if we're going to try to do this work, what are we trying to accomplish? And I think, a lot of that was how do we change the cycle of poverty in a neighborhood, but then how does that really ripple out across the broader community? How do we help our citizens, particularly the public housing residents that had been in the community we ultimately impacted, really work their way out of poverty and have access to the resources necessary to do that. And then, different from what you would consider here, we created a partnership with City Park to rebuild golf in the park, which provided for us an opportunity to create long-term sustainability of our model through revenues generated from golf. So, I think what makes the story unique is again, this is something that impacts multi-generations. We work in space from early childhood education to senior housing and all pieces in between. And I think because of the way we've approached it, it is sustainable. We do have income sources that help fill the gaps that we need. But all of our individual partners are really self-sufficient, with very few exceptions. And it's scalable. I mean, we've worked with other communities, and we've continued to try to push out through our community and beyond the 18 city blocks that we affect to be able to see additional growth and improvement. So Columbia Park at the Bayview District is, as I mentioned, 18 city blocks. It was a former public housing community, the St. Bernard Public Housing Community. It was built in the 40s originally. The housing was originally for returning veterans and ultimately became really one of the most dangerous public housing communities in the city. You'll see a diagram later, but in the 4 years prior to Katrina, there were 44 murders and 684 homicides, felonies within the 18 city blocks of the public housing community. It was very dangerous and really needed to be looked at in a different way. At the time of Katrina, there were 134 buildings in the community, but as you can see, there was really very little street grid. There were 2 through streets that went through the entire community. And at the time of Katrina, we had 8 to 10 feet of water within the neighborhood for 3 weeks. So what was substandard housing became uninhabitable and really created an opportunity to rethink how you approach the rebuild of this community. So the bottom corner of the square is the Columbia Park site. You see proximity to City Park. City Park is the second largest city park, urban park in the country. 1,300 acres. It's about 50% larger than Central Park. So a great asset. I would say that the public housing residents that lived in our community for the most part didn't know it was there prior to Katrina. So a part of it has really been trying to reintroduce the community and the proximity to the park and have crossover programming that allows for them to be able to use that space. Our original plan, which was created, so a little bit about the backdrop. We got back from Atlanta and started down this path and realized that we had no stake in any of what we were trying to impact. We had to work with the housing authority and convince them that mixed income housing was something that made sense. In Atlanta, at East Lake, they had public housing, they had market rate housing, and that model really doesn't work very well because you really need to have the ability to transition into, as you work your way out of public housing, you not have to leave the site and find alternative housing. So the model evolved to really be public housing, low-income housing, and market rate housing, a third, a third, a third. So that was really the approach that we took as we went through planning. We looked at the 18 city blocks, ultimately with the idea to develop 13 of those blocks into mixed income housing, with the balance being set aside for schools. Really, schools as the center of the community, as well as healthcare and retail that can support those services. The idea being to create a walkable community that would be accessible throughout. And as you see, our schools are within 3 blocks of any part of the community within the overall plan. Each block is mixed income. Each building is mixed income. So as you look at 6 townhouse building, 2 public housing, 2 low income, 2 market rate. They're all built the same. We really looked at it as building luxury apartments for residents of all income. I think we've accomplished that. As we were planning and working with our politicians and our police chief in the beginning, they said, well, the police chief said, well, you're just going to put a fence around the whole thing, right? And it's going to be limited access. And we said, no, that's not the idea. We want to connect to the community. Our council person said, well, you're just going to put the public housing up at the corner and make that, separate from what you're doing here. We said, no, that's not the idea either. You really want to be able to integrate the community so that there's that interaction between those low-income residents and market rate so that they're working with their peers and they're learning from each other. As we worked through that planning, we developed phase 1, which is 10 city blocks, 466 units of mixed income housing, 1/3 public housing, 1/3 low income, 1/3 market rate. We developed a plan. We ultimately brought that to the housing authority, who said, okay, we're finally convinced that this is something we ought to pursue, but we're going to do an RFP. So we went through the process of finding a development partner that knew mixed income. What we knew was we could be the visionary, but we were not mixed income developers, we were not educators, we were not healthcare providers. But if we could find the best possible partners in each of those disciplines, we could potentially put together a really compelling model. So we went through an RFP. Integral was a part of that process when we did that, but ultimately selected Columbia Residential, which is a for-profit Atlanta-based mixed income development partner who's done probably 30 or more similar communities across the Southeast. And we submitted in the fall, winter of 2006 to that RFP. Were selected by the Housing Authority to be their development partner in 2007, and then began the process of going through the approval for demolition of 131 of the 134 housing buildings, as well as permitting and planning to be able to get to the starting line. We got those approvals, we made it through city planning, we had a 7-0 vote in favor of moving forward, and we had the luck of being able to close our financing transaction in August of 2008, which was the height of the financial meltdown. We were fortunate. Our tax credit investment partner, Aegon, did not retrade their deal, so we closed at 87 cents on the dollar at a time that the market moved to 60 cents in some cases. But phase one was over a $100 million project. It's the largest low-income housing tax credit project that I think has ever been done. We had the benefit of Go Zone funding, which came out of Katrina, that allowed for much larger phases. And we started construction in 2009, opened in March of 2010, 100% leased at each income level with a waiting list, and we've remained 100% leased since we opened 13 years ago. You can see the site as demolished before we really began construction. The buildings in blue were the 3 housing buildings that we retained. Those buildings ultimately have been converted into our Educare Early Learning Center, which you'll see a little bit more about later. But because we had low-income housing tax credits, we were required to retain some buildings, and we selected those because they were really central to the project, at the center of the community, and could really serve as a gathering point for the community. So this is phase one. Actually goes beyond phase one, but what you'll see is the Educare buildings at that point had been built. The red buildings, or white buildings with red awnings. Phase one was the 10 city blocks. In the center, you had the community center and some residential with a pool and playground. And again, we opened fully leased and have retained that full leasing. Each block, from a security standpoint, is fenced. So in between buildings, there's fencing, and there's gated access, car access with key card that allows you in. So 70% plus of our families are single parent households, the majority single moms. So the ability to bring their kids in with their groceries and be within a contained space, particularly after dark, has been really important and been a big part of the safety and security of the neighborhood. You can see here Educare above, and this is our K-8 school, Kip Believe. We opened Kip Believe in 2019. Bit of a rocky road when you open right before the pandemic, but they're doing well, continuing to see progress. Interestingly, and we'll talk about it when we talk about our Cradle to College approach, Kip Believe was actually within our neighborhood prior to Katrina. They were the first charter school developed and opened. They were open for 3 weeks before Katrina hit, and the building they were in went away, and they moved their school to Houston for a year. Since they returned to New Orleans, they've been in 11 different school buildings before they moved to our site. Elementary school being in different buildings than the middle school, being able to consolidate was a very important piece to bringing them to the community. You'll also see a community garden that was built as part of the site, and our FQHC is at the bottom corner of this site as well. So the overall project, just kind of going through the pieces, we have now 685 rental units, mixed income. Over 70% of those are low income. Educare New Orleans is our early childhood school. It's a Head Start, early Head Start based school, but we've worked with Educare nationally, which was started by Susie Buffett back in the late 90s, really with the idea of how do we help get kids to kindergarten on grade. She brought, when her dad gave her first money for a foundation, he said, pick a cause and go see what you can do. She went to the head of the Omaha school system and said, I'd like to invest in the schools. And they said, no, you really would do better if you get kids here that are kindergarten ready. And so she sought out and found the Educare model, built one in Omaha, thinking that was kind of going to be her deal. There are now 27 of those across the country, 3 in Omaha. And what nationally Educare has accomplished is 95% of the kids that leave Educare are kindergarten ready. In New Orleans, about 20% of the kids that arrive at kindergarten in public school are kindergarten ready. So you think about the ability to actually impact outcomes with kids long-term. Being able to start on time and stay on time versus start behind and stay behind is a big deal on overall outcomes. We rebuilt the street grid, 12 city streets within the community to connect to the surrounding community. We have 3 business centers and 2 theaters. Theaters serve as a gathering point for our families to come and watch movie night, cartoon night, Saints games, maybe not now, since not so much to watch. A swimming pool, a play field that was supported by the NFL and LISC, 3 playgrounds, community garden. McDonough 35 is our high school in the neighborhood, golf course that we opened in 2017, health clinic, and our Kip Believe KA school. We also, over time, have acquired housing in the neighborhood and built affordable, single-family affordable housing. All of our housing, because we're partners with the Housing Authority, will remain rental housing and will remain in a mixed income model for as long as we're probably partners. And then we're currently in process of building a grocery, getting to the starting line of building a grocery, a pharmacy, behavioral health clinic, and teacher housing above our pharmacy and health clinic. So the overall project, you can see we've ultimately put in place, or putting in place, about $328 million of investment, which has been able to be done by levering a little over $20 million of philanthropic support and really utilizing government, LIHTC, new market tax credits, CDBG funds, you name it. We've got different capital stacks for pretty much every project. And all that really done with very little construction debt or pure debt. As I mentioned earlier, our low-income housing tax credits that we got in our various phases, I think are probably the most that have been brought to a single project anywhere. And then we had external development partners like our grocer and others that are part of the overall capital stack. Just kind of a listing of our partners: the Housing Authority, Columbia Residential, Educare, Clover, who works with us on Educare, as well as our community support services, our school partners, City Park, and then some of our health providers, as well as program providers. So from an impact standpoint, as I mentioned, we had a major violent crime problem in the neighborhood in the time before Katrina, no access to early education, and very little access to health care. What we've seen since reopening is we've had over a 99% reduction in crime. It's probably the safest neighborhood in the city at this stage of the game. And that's in great part because there's pride in place by our residents. They look after each other. If they see something, they say something. And I think that's also a reason that our average tenant has lived in our community for over 5 years. rental community, which typically you see turnover that averages a year to a year and a half. We've got 2,000 students in our Cradle to College pipeline. Our childhood poverty rate has been reduced by 50%, and we have over 1,000 kids in our after-school programs during the course of the week. I think one of the amazing things that we didn't see coming was there was a RAND study that was done in 2016 that looked at life expectancy in various communities. Public housing communities in New Orleans had a life expectancy of 55 years old. And if you look at the top, one of the more affluent neighborhoods in Lakeview had an average life expectancy of 80 years. That's a 25-year gap. And that's environmental. I mean, that's access to resources, that's lack of crime, it's a lot of things. What we've seen since we opened is we've seen a life expectancy increase from 55 years to 70 years in the last 15 years. And we see that, we expect that to continue to go up. We have a video, which we're not going to play, but you can access on our website that really kind of talks about, you know, it's some testimonials, but it talks about the impact. We had an impact study done in 2020 by a third party, and it really highlights some of the outcomes and the things that can be possible if you have a community like this that's intentional, that really looks at, I think some of the things that have been talked about today, really the interconnectivity of the various pieces. We spent a lot of time with, we had probably 60 neighborhood meetings, public meetings, as we were designing the project. And one of the things that was very keen was how do we relate to the balance of the community. There was a lot of single-family, one-story buildings prior to Katrina. 8 to 10 feet of water makes that pretty difficult, so a lot of blight in the neighborhood, but a lot of interest in, let's not build high-rises here, let's build buildings that connect in the community. So all of our structures are 2 or 3 story, if not 1, and I think it's really, there was a lot of discussion about what was called then Gentile architecture, which we had never heard of before, but that's the neighborhood we're in. And how do we relate to those, to the housing inventory, the residential inventory in the neighborhood? And I think, you know, there's been a fairly widespread acceptance of the approach. We have a lot of people that, you know, that come to us now and say, you know, we didn't believe you were going to do this when you said you were going to do it. But, you know, we're really amazed and proud of what's happened here, and we're glad to be able to live here and not have to move. And this is one of the testimonials. This woman, her children were going to school not within the neighborhood. They were making D's and F's. They went to some of them went to Educare. They went to Kip Believe. They were able to walk to school, and the convenience of being able to get their kids to school, take the bus to work downtown, come back and get their kids, just made life, you know, that much easier and improved quality of life, which has really been a big part of our objective overall. I think that's it. I guess the other thing that I would just say, and you know, as we looked at this and as we talked with the mayor, we talked with Baptists along the way, the similarities are pretty interesting because we have a 52-acre site, very similar in size to this community. I think the opportunities are similar, but the challenges are not dissimilar either. We had 134 public housing buildings that had to come down, and that was controversial. Some pretty interesting city planning meetings at City Hall. But we ultimately got to the point where we felt like it was the right thing to do to take those buildings down. There really wasn't a lot of contributory value to those buildings that were built in the 40s. We've not been a part of the conversation about demolition here other than, you know, it may or may not need to happen, and it would change how you repurpose and approach the site. I do think that it's, you know, very important from our perspective, the way we approach this, because we really need to provide the services and resources to the residents of the community, whether they were public housing residents or they were in the neighborhood, in our community or in the surrounding community, and providing that access to high quality education from 6 weeks through high school was really an important piece. I think I would think that would be a very valuable piece in a redevelopment here. You have a high school 4 blocks away, so I don't know that you would necessarily look to change that. Maybe work with them on how do we improve that school. But I think early childhood and K-8 could be very important within a model here. And I think green spaces are very important, and how those different uses coexist. You know, whether they all need to be pushed in a corner or whether you spread them out like we've done, where you have that mixed income throughout the community. I think the idea of having some for sale is interesting and may make the economics work better. But obviously, I think you know, there's some things that maybe you can take away from what we've done. We see it as, you know, something that it could be a really interesting opportunity. And what I'll also tell you is that you don't want somebody from out of town coming in and doing this on their own. It needs to be a community-led, civic and business-led, and politically-led initiative, which you can use resources from outside, but you need to have the wherewithal and the will in the local community. I started this as a volunteer 18 years ago. I'm still a volunteer. I've spent probably 80% of my time over that time on this project. You know, I think when we looked at this 15 years ago, we kind of said, boy, it's going to be nice to look at this in 5 years, thinking it was going to be done. But, you know, we've got a lot to look back on now and say, okay, we pretty much did what we said we were going to do, and look what happened. So I hope you all are able to accomplish similar outcomes here. Thank you.
I'll get a sip of water, but thank you so much. It's great. Any questions, thoughts? Jerry?
Jen?
Jerry, would you mind expanding on purpose-built communities and what that is and the technical assistance they provide and where all they are?
Yeah, so interestingly, when we went to Eastlake, there was no such thing as purpose-built communities. We were invited really by Tom Cousins, the developer, who said he really believed that Eastlake could be replicated across the country, but nobody had taken him up on it. And we were kind of an opportunity because of Katrina, because we had a site that we could potentially take on, because we had access to, you know, a very large amount of low-income housing tax credits to be able to undertake it. Since that time, after we were successful in our beginning, Tom Cousins brought Warren Buffett and Julian Robertson of the Tiger Fund in to basically help see if they could accelerate development of similar communities to Eastlake and White District. There are now 25 of those communities around the country, all based on mixed income housing, education, access to health care, recreational services, and wraparound community services that really help identify needs and help work with low-income families to really work their way out of poverty. All of those communities are in different phases. We're probably, with Eastlake, the most complete model, but you know, different models, different structures, different organizational structures, but all with that same goal of, you know, how do we have long-term impact on affecting children and families and working their way out of poverty. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing this to us. I think you've done two pretty important things here. I think number one, you've given us a benchmark for which to strive forward. You've shown us what the art of possible is. There's no reason why this can't work in Pensacola. No reason whatsoever. Funding is not a reason why this can't happen. It's always fun. And the second thing is that you've answered a question, and Ms. Dixon there answers it pretty well, is why? Why do this? And why would somebody want to live in that area? And when you answer that question, why somebody wants to live there, your vision appears itself. You create that vision. Why would somebody want to live there? Because it's safe, because it's a place to send their children, because it's a place to buy groceries, a place to walk their kids, a place to go to work. It's a place to live, to work, to play, and to raise your family. And when you answer that, when you do that, I think a plan for our area, it answers itself.
Yeah, I think interestingly, what we found in our community is that,
Could you repeat the question?
He was talking about the why people would want to live in a community like this, and questions of, does a community like this attract and retain people within the community? I think that's fair. I think there are a couple of different pieces. One, our residents, we have a lot of residents that work in the hospitality industry that take the bus to work. We've got a lot of residents in our community that have moved up the ladder within their organizations because they're working with their peers that live in the same community. And so we, for example, have at points in time had 30 Harris employees, from table dealers to maintenance people to some of the people in the C-suite. And that interface and interaction, there's a credibility that goes with it. And so being able to give people the opportunity to have connectivity with those residents and those coworkers has been valuable. So I think the conversation around transportation and street grids and bus service and the like is important. You want to be able to make sure that people in that community can get to where they work, and that you can ease that. Yes.
I may have missed it, but before the building were demolished, were people living in those buildings? Were they vacant?
So prior to Katrina, there were about 1,300 units. About less than 900 were habitable. So there were about 900 families, but after Katrina, 8 feet of water, none of those people remained in, they couldn't live there. And interestingly, those 900 families went everywhere. So part of our charge when we came back was to find them. We in Columbia Residential spent probably a year and a half just trying to find people that were potentially going to come back. They all were provided preference to move back into the community. But we found, I think, about 650 of the 900 families.
My first question was, I was wondering what happened to the people that were they had to move them all out somewhere else to build the new construction, but
It's, and that's a challenge because a lot of the communities that have been done have been displacing public housing residents and having to place them elsewhere.
Okay.
And then giving them an opportunity to come back. We were fortunate in that, a natural disaster basically made it such we didn't have to have those conversations, but you had a similar conversation because you had to find them and give them an opportunity to come back.
thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah. So have you seen a spillover effect? So you have your footprint, you showed the numbers of the impact that the buildings had. Have you seen a spillover effect with the surrounding neighborhood?
Yeah, so, I think it's somewhat similar to the Baptist site, which has lower income housing north, west, and south, but has more affluent housing to the east. There's a community that's probably less than a mile north that's got $1 million plus houses. What we've seen in the surrounding community is you've seen increased prices in homes. I think we're probably 100% greater than they were prior to Katrina. Part of the challenge has been how do we guard against gentrification? What we did was we built affordable housing. We would basically acquire a low-cost lot, build a house, and sell it at cost so that we could provide opportunities, first to our residents that wanted to move from rental to home ownership, but second, to really make sure that we were not seeing prices get way out of hand. And it's happening in some cases. Average price in this community was probably under $100,000 prior to Katrina. It's probably $225,000 now. But there are $500,000 homes that are, approximate.
So I noticed on the financing slide or the cost, top two items, FEMA over $100 million, is that correct?
Pieces and parts, yes.
Yeah,
It wasn't all FEMA, but it was a part of it was.
Okay. And then you had you said the low-income housing credits. You said those were at a more generous rate because of the post-Katrina, is that right?
Yeah. Well, we got more credits. Typically now, and I think Steve could comment on it, you may get an allocation that will allow you to build 50 or 100 units, not 466.
So those two items alone were, obviously 2/3 of the overall these other communities that don't have that particular set of circumstances where you have a natural disaster come in and just flood those resources, how are they financing these projects?
It's a heavy lift. I think it's forced people to look at things, and may have opinions as well, about, how do we get creative with our financing. In our case, we lost a huge amount of inventory, and it was critical to get back as much as we could, as timely as we could. So not having to build 100 units in a phase, but building 466 was critical. And quite honestly, we opened almost 5 years after Katrina. So there was a 4-year window where that housing didn't exist. So being able to accelerate that by having access to that higher level. But I think what you see in most communities now is they're building 50 units at a time, or they're layering in other financing that's allowing them to do a little bit more than that. And I suspect that's what you'll have to do here. You're not going to have that, I don't think. You may have some other creative financing opportunities that would accelerate that a little bit, but I don't think you're going to go build 400 units in a phase based on current financial resources.
When you talk about how you have the property, it's public housing property, but maybe the differences of a potential Baptist in that, in terms of just who owns it.
Yeah, I think I touched on it a little bit, but the housing within the community is really restricted in that it's always going to be mixed income housing with a high level of public housing because the underlying landowner is the housing authority. We, as partners with the housing authority, own the structures on top. The non-residential pieces, we actually long-term lease from the housing authority, and we built the structures in all cases without government funding support, new market tax credits, philanthropic support, some bank debt cases, and we're able to do that absent the Orleans Parish School Board support or state support. Does that answer?
The capital stack is impressive, clearly was necessary to get done. How is your operational funding looking? Are you maintaining reserve funding? Are you running at an excess? How
Don't we wish?
Yeah.
Well, I would tell you, if you looked back 4 years, so just the housing piece of it, if you look back 4 years ago, we had built up very healthy reserves. The budget is really designed to be a zero bottom line budget with an allocation of reserves on an annual basis. So we built up a nice set of reserves, and then Hurricane Ida hit. And Hurricane Ida in New Orleans, particularly in this neighborhood, we have 89 residential buildings in the neighborhood. Each one of them had damage from the hurricane. We had about $6.5 million of damage, some of which had to come out of our reserves because insurance didn't cover it all. So we're now in the process of trying to build back and hoping we don't have another event for a bit. Operationally, from a foundation standpoint, we have 2 employees. So, we've got a very low overhead at the foundation level. Our structure has always been, and our intent has always been, to really, again, find the best possible partners, let them do the work that they have, and let them be relatively self-sufficient. The only real, what we call quality gap we have is that Educare is a Head Start-based program, but we bring additional resources to it, which really help us allow and achieve the 95% plus kindergarten readiness that happens there. So there's an annual quality gap that we have to fill of probably about $500,000, which is typically through philanthropy and other grants. Yes?
I have a comment and a question. The comment is, we see again and again, government isn't really built for risk-taking. And usually government acts most boldly after its back is against the wall in a crisis. After a hurricane, after some major disaster. Because the risk to any one government official of acting is much lower because you're responding to an emergency. So it really takes political courage to act boldly in a non-crisis situation. And I feel like that's where this group, this room, really needs to kind of rally around your government to act boldly in the public interest. You're not in a crisis, you have an enormous opportunity. But it's often really not in government's interest to be courageous and to take risks. So I just think that's worth like reminding ourselves, like what are your shared values and where do you want to go and how do we get there? And we may not have like the silver bullet of $100 million pot of money, but there may have never been a moment where there's more federal money flowing through every level of government. So, get your fair share. The question I have is, when you look back, anything you do differently as a lesson learned, and specifically, like, are you happy with the residential density that you ended up with? I think it's like 13 units per acre.
Probably, 13 to 15. I think to some degree it was driven by kind of that neighborhood design intent of we don't want to have 6-story homes, 6-story apartment buildings. We don't want it to be, quite honestly, the reason that we had so much hurricane damage is we were the highest rooftops throughout the community. So, we kind of sheltered the damage to the rest of the community, but I think that was, intentional and trying to make sure we fit into the neighborhood. Lessons learned, again, I would have hoped we could have done this in 8 years instead of 18. And Village Street's been there for 5 years. But we had, we were somewhat neophytes in the public-private space, and we dealt with, I think I mentioned, we dealt with 8 different housing authority executives that were babysitting because it was in receivership. And we had to educate each one of them. And so that was, that was a challenge. New Orleans is not an overly rich city. So we have a lot of nonprofits looking for a lot of money, and there's only limited resources to get them. So, I think those were some of the kind of handcuffs we had to overcome. I don't know that I'd change a whole lot. I think New Orleans, the educational component of New Orleans is all charter schools. It's mostly worked, but we're still not a high-performing system. And we have about 70 schools, and 7 of those are A and B schools. So there's a ways to go yet. I think we've always been willing to try new things, and most of them have worked, but not all. I think kind of like here, if you don't try and you don't, see what you can make, your success is going to be way more than your failures. And I think that's what we've learned in part.
Thank you. Congrats.
Anybody else?
All right. Thank you again. Again, continue to reiterate my thanks and my gratefulness that, I see so many people in the room working on so many projects that isn't this one right now that are very, very busy, and I'm very appreciative of this. What I hope is next steps is really 2 things. One, we'll be reaching out to you really just to get some of your feedback and thoughts as you think about this, and we'd love for you to share that with us. It could be a thought, a concern, something that didn't get answered. And I think as we start to again narrate this and compile what we think is best, that we would ask you to do that. And I do mean what I say is, we may look in the first quarter of next year as an opportunity for folks that may be interested to go over, if he'd be so gracious to yet again walk us around. It sounds like you've got a lot of practice with 120 cities coming to do it, so you've got the pitch nailed. But if there were folks that were interested in this room and beyond, certainly we want to make sure that advocates of the neighborhood, folks who have lived there a long time, that can come see what something could look like with their own eyes. Whereas folks in this room may have been involved in projects, similar scales of projects, I think at the end of the day, the city's primary role in this, I believe, Is it to be the master developer the same way it's not Baptist's role? We would find the right folks to help us do that. But this is a transformational opportunity for a neighborhood in our city, and how we make school accessible, how we make housing accessible to that neighborhood is of the utmost importance. So we would probably bring an even bigger group, including hearing the thoughts and opinions of folks that have lived in the surrounding area for decades. That could come take a look and see what they think. So again, thank you guys so much. You'll get an email from Alex or myself reaching out to you just to share any feedback that you have. Certainly feel free to go ahead and do that proactively if you'd like to send us an email. And we will follow up with you and continue to work with Baptist to get us our best shot going to legislative session here over the next few months and go from there. So thank you guys again for the time. I appreciate it.